Well, thank you very much, Sarah and Simon. It's great that you could be here again since you make all this possible. And welcome to each and every one of you, to those who survived my first effort here and have returned, and to all of you who are just here for the first time. Today we're going to talk about women's economic participation in the continuum of some of the absolutely key rights that women should enjoy every place. One of the big challenges we face all over the world is how to grow economies and ensure shared prosperity for all nations and all people. Hillary Clinton, when speaking to the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum, APEC, a couple of years ago, said to achieve the economic expansion we all seek, we need to unlock a vital source of growth that can power our economies in the decades to come. And that source is the power of women. And just 2 months ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, when Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, now got up to speak, she focused all of her remarks on inclusive power and inclusive growth. And she said the evidence is clear that when women do better, economies do better. So as we shall see as I go through some of these points today, that even when women in agriculture have access to equal resources, 100 to 150 million more people avoid hunger. When they are participating fully in the workforce, the GDPs of countries grow. And we all lose out if we don't empower women as an economic force, but of course women first and foremost lose out in not having that opportunity. Just a few weeks ago, Booz & Company, a major purveyor of studies and consulting, issued a study called The Third Billion. And the predicate of that work is that 1 billion women are poised to make an economic contribution, an enormous economic contribution to economies around the world that could rival that of India and China if they are empowered. And I underscore, if they are empowered. Because to become empowered, women's rights must be safeguarded and opportunities must be made available to them. And they need to overcome the barriers that still hold them back. Around the world, women are concentrated in low-paying jobs, on farms, in family unpaid work, in the informal sector. This limits their earnings potential and productivity, as well as their time that could be utilized in other ways. There are also large numbers of workers on the move today, many of them in desperate situations. I often feel when I look at the globe that you see large movements of people, many women with their children, many migrants in search desperately for work, refugees who are leaving areas of conflict, some who have been coerced into believing that a good job awaits them, only to find themselves in the nightmare of human trafficking. All because they believe that there is a real job with real prospects awaiting them. Although women do much of the world's work, they get 10% of its income and own about 1% of the property. Legal and social barriers continue to impose their own limits. According to the World Bank, more than 100 countries have laws that restrict women's economic activity. And this is certainly true for the developing world, but there are also constraints in the so-called developed world that each of you who come from that part of the world know the kinds of things that continue to be written about on the front pages of papers and all the other ways we get our news today that talk about that constant effort to balance and ways in which women still feel difficulty in breaking in successfully into the formal sector. Both laws and customs often stand in the way of women's empowerment. Defending workers' rights and improving their conditions is also essential because many women in the developing world today are finding themselves in manufacturing work, for example, in factories that if you talk to them, as I have on many occasions, they will tell you how dramatically their lives have changed for the better because they now have a steady income. It may not be what any of us would like to see for ourselves, for sure, but for them it is that movement in a direction in which they have craved. But those conditions that they engage in need to be conditions that are respectful of their human dignity and their rights. By the same token, women's economic independence is necessary to advance their rights. If one is economically independent, one is in much better shape. In fact, there are a number of studies today that show a direct correlation between a woman's economic independence and less violence against women, less gender-based violence, because she can stand up for herself, and in a way she is viewed differently from the way she may have been viewed when she wasn't in a position of having her economic independence. But at the same time, jobs, just as there are rights that have to be protected to advance that economic empowerment. So one side of the coin is that economic independence advances your rights, but the other side of the coin is your rights have to be protected to get there. So there is a lot that weighs on all of this. Today, there is a literally large volume of data, studies, all kinds of research emanating from a variety of sources, from academic institutions, from think tanks, from governments, from multilateral institutions, indeed from the private sector, that underscores the vital nature of women's economic activity. I mentioned when I was in the first lecture 2 days ago, I mentioned the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report. Well, that report, which measures the progress of men and women on 4 metrics, health, education, economic participation, and political empowerment, looks at how large the gender gap is in a given country on those 4 indicators. And where that gap is closer to being closed, and in nowhere is it closed, but where it is closer to being closed on those 4 metrics, those countries are far more prosperous and economically competitive, which explains why the World Economic Forum looks at this measurement. Women also yield a double dividend in their work because they invest up to 90% of their incomes in their families and communities. For example, on healthcare, on education, the kinds of things that are investments for a multiplication of greater prosperity, investments in the future, investments in what education represents and what sound health represents, as opposed to just engaging in non-productive behavior with that income. And at the same time, this income drives illiteracy down and drives mortality down, and that lifts up families and communities. The case for unlocking the potential of women and including them more fully in the economic life of our nations, I think, has to begin with acknowledging with what women are already doing to make an enormous contribution to economic growth around the world. The Economist points out that the increase in employment of women in the developed world during the past decade alone has added more to global growth than China. Now, that's a lot of growth. So there are huge productivity gains by even modest increases in women's workplace participation. Studies also show that women run small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, these small businesses, are drivers of economic growth and jobs creation. Now, it's true in my country, it's true in most countries, that small and medium-sized businesses are that great wind at the back of the economies. That's where jobs get created. That's where incomes are generated. Now, many of you know about microcredit and what small amounts of credit have done to enable micro-entrepreneurs, those women in the villages who are steeped in poverty, but with not just the credit, and I think this is a misunderstanding of the credit, but the credit makes all the difference, but with proper training and good habits. Grameen, for example, is a paramount example of this phenomena. That is able and has enabled literally hundreds of millions of women to transform their lives. I have had the privilege, and it is a privilege, to sit with these extraordinary people, many of whom are illiterate, many of whom live and work in conditions that are extremely difficult, and yet how proud they will tell you they are at what they've been able to achieve. I remember once being with a woman in Bangladesh, sitting with a group of borrowers, and I asked her how this had worked for her. And she said, well, I got my first loan and I bought a milk cow. And that produced not only nutrition for our family, but with what was left over, we sold it and our lives are much better. Now, these are truly micro businesses. And she said, I paid back my loan because usually you're in a borrowing group and each one stimulates the other to be responsible. And these loans are paid back in ways that are the envy of any commercial lending institution that doesn't lend to women for the most part. But all of these are paid back close to 100%. And this woman said, so we did so well, I got another loan and we bought another milk cow. And she paid that one back. And I thought, well, there's probably a third milk cow coming around. And she said, and when I got my third loan, I bought my husband a rickshaw so he could go to work. And then another woman, this one was with SEWA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. It is a remarkable organization. Over 1.5 million women band into this association. It's like a trade union, but it's very different in many ways. And they leverage what they make and produce, etc. And I was in this city in India, Ahmedabad, which is the headquarters of SEWA. And there were lots of women who had previously been rag pickers. And when we asked one of the women, or all of the women, and one stood up initially, what difference this had made in her life. She said, "I am no longer afraid." And I thought, well, that's very powerful. Imagine a poor woman who had been kicked around, was a rag picker, and she's so empowered, she said, "I am no longer afraid." But then she added, "I'm not afraid of the police, not afraid of civil power. I'm not afraid of my husband." And then the pièce de résistance, "and I am not afraid of my mother-in-law." And anybody who knows mother-in-law's power in India knows the power of that statement. So this whole ability to get training and credit and enable the poorest of the poor in many ways to have the opportunity to gainful enterprise, micro enterprise, has truly had a transformative impact. But where the growth accelerators and jobs creators are is with SMEs. And that's a more complicated proposition because you're talking about much bigger, although small businesses, or not these kinds, but still small and medium-sized enterprises. And they require more resources to get started for the provision of the, what one would sell or services, etc. And one of the problems that women have, even though we know that SMEs have this extraordinary impact both on the business person as well as on the greater economy, is that women confront all kinds of barriers that under similar conditions men do not, certainly at the complexity of the components. Laws and customs often create roadblocks. In some places, as you all know, I'm sure, women have no right to inheritance, no right to own property. They often lack training, mentors, access to technology, access to markets, access to finance, probably the most difficult resource to procure because you have to go to a bank for the most part to get the kind of capital you need to start or expand your SME. So this lack is something that clearly needs to be addressed for the sake of the participants as well as for the sake of the greater good. Other studies show that a reduction in barriers to female labor force participation would increase, for example, in my country, would increase our GDP by 9%, which would be a good thing in today's economy, or these Eurozones by 13%, or Japan by 16%. So these kinds of barriers and restrictions erode women's abilities to participate fully in their economies, to support their families, either as employees or as entrepreneurs. The other thing that's really interesting today, and there's a lot of data that's coming out on this, is that women are the growing consumer market in the world. A Boston Consulting Group survey showed that by 2014, women worldwide will control $28 trillion and ultimately in the next decade be responsible for over 2/3 of spending. Now, why is that important in the context of this? Well, if you're a business and you want to sell your products and you want to sell your services, you don't have any women in management, you don't have any women on your boards, you don't include women, and this is a big issue today, certainly in the more complicated economies, lots of women graduating from some of the best institutions, getting inside the door, rising up, but then stuck. This means you need women in design. You need women in strategic thinking. You need women for the growth of your business. If we're talking about just the role of female participation in these businesses. So this is part of the discussion also today in terms of what companies have to recognize in their own interest. If a different interest doesn't speak to it, their own interest, self-interest being a driver in recognizing the role of women as consumers, and then backing that up with what that represents for their own workforce, for their own management. Now, as you heard, I most recently left the State Department, where I held the position as Ambassador for Global Women's Issues, which was a new position for our government. And in the State Department, there are issues that obviously have to do with international affairs that one grapples with every day. But there are also issues of economic statecraft, because a lot of what's happening in the world today is focused on the state of economies. Often conflicts come out of the state of economies, and there are huge implications for the well-being of countries in all of this. And I'll just go through a few of the ways that we tried to address what the data was telling us as a way also to advance women's progress in the role that women have in our world today. First of all, we recognize the importance of public-private partnerships. And I think that today there is a growing recognition that government alone doesn't have all the answers. The private sector doesn't have all the answers. Civil society, what you all represent, academia, the larger NGO world, the place where most of us represent the stuff of our work, that we need each other. We need the competencies each has. We need the resources. And if we were to work together, we would have greater success. And in this area that represents women's economic participation, there is a growing recognition by companies in their self-interest that they need to be doing more. And I think this is another trend today, which is looking at one's economic interest, economic value, what businesses do, but also recognizing that it can have social value. And I'm not talking about corporate social responsibility or charity, but really associating with the brand of a company, if you will, both this economic and social value. And so there are companies today, Coca-Cola, for example, has started a major initiative called 5 by 20 to create 5 million new women entrepreneurs by 2020. And a lot of that work is going on in villages in Africa and other places to raise the micro actors up to another level. Goldman Sachs, for example, has a program called 10,000 Women to invest in the training for small business women or those who want to expand their business by partnering with academic institutions around the world to provide women who are at that stage where they can benefit from this kind of training to grow their business, add more people to the jobs, the number of employees they have. Walmart has created a program, the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative, to take its supply chain. You know, big companies are buying all kinds of resources, supplies, services that they need just in the course of business for their companies. This is an effort to source from women-run small and medium-sized businesses. Now, clearly those businesses have to be certified, they have to meet specifications. But what this does for an SME, a woman-run SME, is it creates literally billions of dollars of market expansion that they would otherwise not have. So to support these kinds of efforts is part of what I think one is beginning to see as a trend, factoring in some of the data that I mentioned at the outset. Another way we try to push this forward is by utilizing some of those international platforms that governments engage in, where countries come together in a commitment to a certain mission. So let's say APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, is 21 economies from perhaps the most dynamic part of the world, the Asia Pacific region. Now, for some reason, this issue of women and the economy was never on the APEC agenda. And yet, you look at many of the countries that could grow exponentially if they factored in and really paved the way for women to have greater opportunities. And what happened in the last few years through our efforts and the efforts of others was to put this issue on the agenda of APEC. And for the first time ever, 2 years ago, there was, as part of this major convening, a Women and the Economy component that included the private sector and ministers from all over those economies, with the goal of addressing the barriers that are keeping women back. And so part of the declaration that was adopted was to focus on markets, to focus on capital, to focus on women's leadership, to focus on training, and that was adopted at the highest levels. Now, take a country like Japan, which has had great difficulty in jump-starting its economy. Now, if any of us were to sit down with some of the young women like you, many of you here in Japan, you have great ambition to work in the jobs market in the areas that you're interested in, to work full-time, and you have a dream to be good parents, too. To do that balancing, that's sometimes very difficult, but shouldn't preclude you from being a good parent and being a good employee. And what the situation is in Japan is, for the most part, this is very difficult to do because of the traditions, the expectation that if one has a child, she should stay home with the child until he or she is grown. And it is not encouraging to so many who want to have both, as is in the case in most places. So when I was recently with some of the Japanese government representatives, they were talking about how they're beginning to realize how critical this is if they're going to move their economy forward, which is necessary for the overall well-being of their country. Another area is trade. We live in a world of open trade now, for the most part. And women have a very difficult time. Women in business have a generally difficult time in competing to have access to markets bigger than they might have otherwise. And one of the efforts that we've engaged in is to be enablers for them to take greater advantage of these opportunities. Now, one such example is called AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act, which is a capacity that is available to business people in Africa with the kind of restrictions that might ordinarily surround trade. Those barriers are lowered tremendously, and their goods can flow out and they can benefit from those sales if they know what to do. And so joining with a lot of other partners, we formed the Africa Women's Empowerment Program to enable small and medium-sized business women to take advantage of these kinds of agreements, to be able to become export ready, something that many of them were not, and to be with them when they describe how their businesses have grown exponentially, how their ability to employ so many others who had no great opportunities, how all of that has changed, and to see them speak truth to power, to tell their leaders why they need to be reducing barriers and why they need to be changing policies, and not look at them as just, oh, what do they know about economics? But all of a sudden to look at them with different eyes as extraordinary contributors to the well-being of their countries. And this is by no means exhaustive, but I want to mention one other area, and I will keep coming back to this by virtue of being here at Cambridge, by virtue of being with people who appreciate what research is all about, but to tell you how important it is, if no one has, and I doubt that, how important it is to what we're discussing. And that is to have the kind of data that buttresses the best policies that one can develop to be able to have an impact. So there's the OECD, the Organization for European Cooperation and Development, which has many member countries and is one of those places that, among all the things it does, it is a real center for data collection. And out of an effort over the last couple years, there was a strong push within the OECD for a gender initiative. And a big part of this was to call on the OECD to improve data collection on women's employment and entrepreneurship, and to work with other organizations like UN Women, like the World Bank, that also collect data, to have that kind of harmonization of the data so we can understand what is exactly going on. And it is quite stunning how much we still don't know, because while all kinds of issues are being explored, this is one that had not risen to the top in the way it needs to be, as critically important to the very important things that these bodies always discuss. So those are some of the ways that we and others today are trying to enable women's economic participation to be what it has the potential for being. And a lot of that has to do with enabling women to overcome the hurdles that stand in their way. I want to speak a little bit on women in agriculture. It may sound like, well, what is this coming to here? But it is such an important area, because women are vital to the agriculture sector. In many, many countries, developing countries, they are the backbone of the economy. They comprise, in many countries, the majority of the small farmers. Yet their work is usually not counted in many economies as economic active employment. I'll tell you this a story. Once I was traveling with Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady, and we were in an African country, and we were being lectured to by a minister of the economy in this country. And he went on and on about how women had no role in the economy of that country. And needless to say, the First Lady was getting quite exasperated. We're in a van. We're looking out this side of the windows, that side, and as far as the eye could see, it was women in the fields, many of them with water on their backs, with wood, bent over, cultivating whatever the crops were, often with babies in tow. And he said women had no role in the economy. And finally, having heard enough, she said, Well, sir, if these women stopped doing what they're doing for one day, your country would shut down. And that's part of what needs to be understood in all of this. Women farmers do not have equal access to the resources that they need to enhance their productivity. Their levels of productivity are not examples of their being slothful or lazy, not working hard enough. It's everything to do with the fact that they don't have the resources that they need. They are often at a severe disadvantage when it comes to securing land tenure rights or owning land outright, probably the most fundamental need that they have. And there's all kinds of creative thinking today going into how to enable women to have equal land rights, or to receiving the training they need through extension programs that often don't factor in the small female farmer, even though she may represent the majority of farmers in the country. And other resources, from credit to seeds to fertilizer to machinery to whatever, are critical. Now, one of the most important bodies in the United Nations on this issue is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And very recently, they put out in their State of Agriculture annual reports, they devoted it to the role of women, the bottom line being, which is vital to agriculture, and provided a series of data and projections on how important it is to equalize the resources to produce the kind of yields that would be equal to those of their male counterparts. But they pointed out there is a huge gender gap in access to resources, and closing that gap and providing women with the same resources as male farmers could increase, if that were to happen, yields by 20 to 30%, which in turn would improve agriculture production by 2.5 to 4%, and that, in the aggregate, would provide nourishment for 100 million to 150 million people today who go hungry. This is the kind of impacts that women could have in this sector if they had the kind of ability to have access to the resources they need. In the Obama administration, one of the biggest development initiatives that the president issued a couple of years ago is called Feed the Future. It's about a $3.5 billion commitment to strengthen the world's food supply so that farmers can earn enough to support their families, but to create greater efficiencies to feed that many more broadly. And because of the vital role that women play in agriculture, this initiative has as one of its key goals integrating gender into all aspects of the program and then measuring the results to ensure that the goals are being met. And when this was being developed, I remember sitting around long conference room tables as all of the work was put into this, and efforts were being made to come up with the kind of indicators that would show whether or not women farmers were going to be benefiting from the program. And for example, if women's income goes up, that is a primary indicator that obviously their lives have improved. If the nourishment of their children goes up, if the nutritional value goes up, that is another example. So these are the kinds of things that are important as we look at that wide area of women's economic participation. Now, all of you know that economic activity today takes place in an increasing globalized economy, with trade openness, with technological transformation, with rapid exchanges of information. You're involved in all of that every day. And for some, this means greater equality and greater possibility. For others, it means lagging behind, even more significantly, unless the gender gap in economic opportunity, in capacity building, in empowerment is closed. Globalization should not mean the marginalization of women. And the way to ensure that women benefit is to close these gaps. There's one last area I want to talk about, and then we can have our conversation. And that is the area of technology. This is an area that has the potential to transform the lives of women around the world by providing critical access to information, mitigating their health and safety risks, and creating financial security and independence. Something as simple as the simple cell phone, not the one with all kinds of fangle-dangled fancy components to it. The simple cell phone is being used today around the world where it is available as an essential tool for poor women to be able to transform their lives. And I have been with many of these women and have seen firsthand what the accessibility to this simple device represents for them. It's being used to teach literacy to people who are illiterate. It is being used to empower. Imagine the woman in the village who has her products to take to market. She starts out on foot. She has no idea where the market is on that day, but she begins to make that long trek. With a call, she will learn if there's a market today. A woman from Senegal told me that she has taken on another job because she has saved so much time walking needlessly to markets that didn't exist on a given day. Imagine a farmer who doesn't know what the weather conditions are, now having that information. Imagine pregnant women in remote areas who don't know how serious their signs of a complicated pregnancy may be, getting that information, and this is now becoming more available if they have access to it. And then think, and this is the one that is mind-boggling for me. I explained how microcredit has changed the lives of hundreds of millions of the poorest of the poor. Well, most of the poor are unbanked today. That simple cell phone increasingly is becoming the tool to be able to save your money safely, which is a very difficult thing for women in a lot of places especially, and to be able to move your money from a husband who is driving a taxi, say in Nairobi, but whose family is far, far away in a place where there are no jobs. He needs to get the money to her. It used to be almost impossible. Today, it's done in Kenya through the use of a cell phone. He goes into a kiosk, the money is deposited, she goes into a comparable place, and she gets the money. There are legions of stories, and there are volumes being written about the transformative impact of the ability to safely save and conduct financial transactions for the poor, because the poor have resources, and this will enable them to grow those resources. In too many instances, however, this tool, as significant as it is and could be, According to studies, there's been one that the Cherie Blair Foundation did in conjunction with GSMA, which is the Trade Association for Mobile Technology Operators. It shows a tremendous gender gap by about some 300 million women who don't have access to the cell phone. And that's why one of the things that we did a couple of years ago is team up with GSMA to elicit a commitment from some of the telephone operators of these companies to begin to plow an investment into areas that very poor people live in, where they might not have made that investment, and demonstrate to them that it could be a sound business investment. And through our development agency, some of those business plans were actually developed. So this is an area that, if, again, the right people come together, poor people can benefit, and women especially can benefit in ways that will truly have positive impact. And lastly, let me mention the internet. Just a few weeks ago, before I left my job at the State Department, I joined with a company called Intel, which many of you may know, which released a study on the gender gap in the internet. You all know that there is no doubt, certainly over the last decade, that the internet has created a revolution. Never before has information so widely available been made so widely available, or people better connected to each other in ways that some of us could never have imagined. The internet can be a great equalizer, and yet access to it is not equally distributed. And this gap is even more salient for women, particularly in the developing countries. Internet access can provide great economic, social, and professional value. But the gender gap in accessing it has very serious consequences for women. It is an increasingly ubiquitous tool. Yet 43% in sub-Saharan Africa do not have any access. Affordability of access is a challenge for everyone, but it is especially a challenge for women and girls. And without access to the internet, women lack access to its tools, its resources, and the opportunities that it would provide. Substantial internet access can boost women's income and potential. It can also increase their sense of empowerment. But bridging the gap will require collaboration, determination, sectors working together, governments and private sector, and civil society. Because if women and girls had greater access and that gap were closed, it would also boost the growth, the economic growth in their countries exponentially, and provide opportunities for countless women and girls. So all of this underscores my primary point. When we liberate the economic potential of women, we elevate them, we provide them with the possibility of economic independence, but we also elevate the economic performance of communities and nations. However, women face countless barriers that will have to be addressed for the kind of results that one hopes for to become real. I met a woman years ago in Chile. She was a seamstress. She had one sewing machine that was manually worked, And she had a vision for what a high-powered machine would do for her. But she had no access to the small amounts of capital she needed to realize that dream. And she said when it became a reality, she felt like a bird that flew out of a cage. She had been caged in many ways. Her potential had been limited. This same woman today has many more machines. She has a large number of employees, and she has sent her children to college. This is the kind of possibility that can be made real. But it can only be made real if we enable women to develop their potential, to have the opportunities to overcome the barriers. And if they do, we know that women's progress means progress for all of us. Thank you.